Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to episode 131 of 2-Minute Talk Tips, the podcast that begins with a practical tip in the first 2 minutes of every episode before getting into a deeper discussion about public speaking. This week's tip comes to us from special guest Dennis Sumlin.
You know how people, they are afraid of public speaking. They get anxious. They get nervous about standing in front of people. And so one of my messages is, rethinking your anxiety. So anxiety is just energy in the body, like any other energy is. Arousal is energy. Anxiety is energy. So what I tell people to do is, don't think of it as anxiety and nervousness. Think of it as energy. Refocus your mind. And when you're feeling that feeling, interpret it as energy, as excitement, as you can't wait to get in front of the people and give them your message because the audience is already on your side anyway. So instead of dwelling on the negative aspects of your excitement, like people are not going to like me and I don't have nothing to say or whatever, change your mindset around that and think of that energy as excitement, because we have a choice on how to think of any energy that enters our body.
Stick around, and after the break, we'll hear more from Dennis Sumlin. One thing a lot of guests on this show talk about is the importance of authenticity, of being true to yourself when you're speaking. And that doesn't always mean you're up there sharing the very essence of your core trauma or, the most deepest personal types of things about you. It's about when you're speaking, about being true to yourself, about acknowledging the things that are important to you, and in speaking about them in a way that makes sense. Two people should be able to give the same speech, and yet it be a different experience in listening to each of them because of their own personal, authentic spin that comes out of it, their own personal way of expressing those concepts, those ideas, those facts, telling those stories, the way they carry themselves on stage. And on and on. All those little different things that we bring to the stage can make a difference. The other key thing that authenticity drives, though, is confidence. Because when you are being your true self, when you are letting your own personal self come through in your talk, it is so much easier to be confident than when you're trying to put on a mask and trying to carry an extra costume onto the stage, because you don't have to worry about maintaining that false front. You can be true to yourself. It becomes a lot easier to be confident and to stand up there on that stage and to give your talk. Dennis Sumlin is a life coach, a public speaking coach, and a podcast producer. His core message is all about authenticity and developing that core confidence that can drive you to success in other areas of your life. And specifically, the subset that he focuses on is on helping men achieve that, helping men understand what it means to be a man in the modern era and how they can apply that confidence and develop their own skills to be more effective speakers and to be more effective in their lives overall. Now, that doesn't mean that Dennis is a spokesman for the men's rights movement or anything like that. He's really just trying to help folks understand how masculinity, how being a man fits into speaking, fits into success in life in this modern era. In this episode, Dennis shares his experience of loving the stage from early in life to pursuing the Toastmasters program and taking leadership roles within Toastmasters to ultimately going ahead and developing his own coaching products, speaking business, and podcast. So now, let's go ahead and meet Dennis. So Dennis, thank you so much for joining us on 2-Minute Talk Tips this week.
I am grateful and glad to be here.
You've talked about a number of really interesting things and a number of really important things, especially with some of the issues facing our culture these days. But let's start off with the very beginning. What's sort of your earliest memory of speaking or performing in front of a group?
I remember in fourth grade, we were doing a play, Rip Van Winkle, And all I remember of that is I was dressed in some sort of a ninja suit somehow. And I remember I looked like a priest when I saw the pictures come back. So that was one. And there was another one.
That sounds like an awesome play. I want to see the ninja interpretation of Washington Irving's classic.
Yeah, I don't know why I was in that. I remember having that costume, but I don't know why I was wearing it in that particular instance. And then another one, which is something that I did when I was a child in church. All the children were doing all of these different recitements and songs and things. So my mother gave me this piece that she wanted me to memorize and recite in this, specialized church service. This piece was all about a suit. I don't remember all the words of it now, but it was all about this suit. Of course, when I gave it, I was dressed all nice and in a suit. I'm good looking anyway, and a suit just makes it better. I just talked about my suit in front of people. I don't know. So those are my first two memories of that.
Those childhood experiences are so powerful, and how folks actually get that experience, that first experience in front of a crowd, is often going to be in front of those pageants or in front of a congregation, and those things can be so formative in developing someone as a speaker. I remember doing those grade school plays and even a kindergarten play where we each had to be dressed up as one of the letters from the big letter board we had up in the classroom, and I chose to be Mr. J. J was for junk because I got to wear a cool costume which just had junk attached to it.
Yeah, well, hey, that's the J is for junk. I wonder what I would have dressed. Maybe something unusual like an X or a Z.
Yeah. So it sounds like you really enjoyed those early experiences.
I did. You know what it is? I being on stage, I always had an obsession, and this obsession goes back to probably when I was in diapers somehow. I love the stage. I love when I was a kid looking out on the crowd. I love going up on stage and being one of those people that was just kind of there. And another one thing I really, really, really enjoyed. I had an obsession with microphones and lecterns. I loved standing behind a lectern and having my hands on the lectern and the microphone is ahead of me and I'm speaking to a crowd. Ever since I was a kid, I loved it. I loved the microphones. I used to speak into these empty soda cans like it was a microphone. It was just always that way.
I remember back in the 70s playing with the parents' reel-to-reel tape recorder and just recording early monologues. So I suppose I was sort of podcasting for an audience of one back before anybody had ever thought this could possibly be a thing.
Well, you know what? That just takes me back to when I was still as a child here. I started, because I do some voiceover work too. So I started doing skits, actually. I did all the voices, and it would be simplistic skits arranged in a comedy kind of series, and I would record them on audio cassette. And I did that when I was a kid, and I have a bunch of them. And actually, just recently, a number of years ago, I started doing that again, of course, in a more adult fashion. It's kind of an adult cartoon now. But all those voiceovers, all those monologues for one, all those, I used to call talk shows when I was a kid. I was just heavily obsessed with audio, speaking to people, being in front of people. That's just kind of, I guess it was in my blood from the very beginning.
That is fantastic, and you just start building up that whole library and really getting that practice in early. That's great. I love that.
Oh, absolutely. I was always doing it. This is in my blood. Like there's not a day that goes by that I don't make one of my character voices that I use for voiceovers. It's like breathing. It's like you get up in the morning and you breathe, and you get up in the morning you hear me go, "Oh, honey, darling child."
So are they just intended as sort of completely original voices, or are they voices of people you've grown up with and people you've known?
No, these are original voices. As you know, maybe with character construction, you take conglomerates of things you've heard in the past and put them together and make an original character out of it. So, these voices are just characters I kind of just formulated.
So, what are you doing now when you're very comfortable getting up on the stage and probably chomping at the bit to get up on a stage, but what are you doing in that 5 minutes before a talk begins?
When I got to go up there and give a talk, those 5 minutes leading up to it, when they're about to announce me or the previous speaker is about wrapping up, I'm sitting there thinking, okay, my bullet points. I'm quickly going over all my make sure I memorize my bullet points. Going over that in my head quickly. Boom, 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 boom. All right. And also mentally pacing out how I'm going to open with the opening line. You write your opening line word for word almost, that opening paragraph, that first 10 seconds. And I'm just going over in my mind, okay, these first, the opening lines I'm going to do, I'm thinking about easing into it. I'm thinking about how I'm going to come on stage, just double checking everything that I've, practiced and studied and formulated. I'm kind of doing a 5-minute fast run through in my head. And just, preparing myself to take that stage mentally.
Recentering and focusing on everything that you need to be focused on over the course of the next talk.
Absolutely.
So you've been a very powerful speaker from an early age. You've been very comfortable with it. Usually, most of the folks who get involved with Toastmasters, it seems folks are getting involved in the organization because they're afraid to speak and they know they need to, or they don't have any of the skills. So how did you get involved in Toastmasters, and why did you choose that?
When I was going back to, I think we were talking before the show about my very first podcast, which was a while ago. It was a political show, current events based.
One of the very first podcasts in existence.
Probably. I don't know. But, as you said, I already had, lots of speaking experience up to that point, and I had never taken a speaking course. I took an improv course when I was a kid. But when I heard of Toastmasters, I'm like, oh, okay, it's for public speaking. And I had never really formally gone into public speaking itself. And so I was around a lot of people that were talking about Toastmasters. And my girlfriend at the time was part of Toastmasters where she was. And so I'm like, one day I looked it up and there was Toastmasters near me, Toastmasters group near me. I always say this, I knew how to speak before I knew what I was doing. So at that time, I did not know that I knew how to speak. I just knew I liked speaking. So I'm going to Toastmasters to learn how to speak because I don't think that I know how to speak, even though I already do. That's weird. So I go there and it's great. I'm having a good time. They have this thing called table topics where you just kind of get up and they just throw a question or a word at you and you just start going for it for 2 minutes. I think that's great. Every time I went there, I did table topics and I used to win a ribbon. And I'd come home and I'd call my girlfriend, hey, I won a ribbon today at Toastmasters. And she would go, well, I did too. And we kind of have a ribbon competition. I don't know. I went on and off to those meetings for a couple of years, but it was like maybe 3-4 times in total over those first couple of years. And then I stopped. I got distracted. My life went in a different direction. Well, not a different direction. I just got busy doing other things. I stopped going to Toastmasters. I didn't stop speaking, but I stopped going to Toastmasters. So 7 years later, I'm thinking about Toastmasters again. 7 years later. And I look it up again. Oh, okay, here's a Toastmasters meeting right next to me. I thought it was the first one I went to, many years earlier. And it turned out not to be. But I stuck with it because I was in a different position in my life. And I had much more experience under my belt the second time I went to Toastmasters. So I decided to join it. I liked the vibe of the club. I liked what they were doing. I liked the way people were towards me, very friendly, very inviting, very everything. And so I stuck with it. I would say within 6 months, I was already running for president of that club. I think within 6-7 months, I had already finished their first 10 speeches, which at that time was their first level, called a competent communicator. And so, everything went pretty rapidly once I decided to join and paid membership and then ran for office. Everything just kind of took off from there.
There's a couple of really cool things in there. I think the community aspect is an important aspect of a group like that, and I also think there's a lot of fun and power in the idea of having that friendly competition with your girlfriend about the ribbon competition, and really sort of making it a thing that folks can do together.
Absolutely. We would come home and compare notes and my ribbon and I kept those ribbons for a long time. And what's cool about that, the very first club I went to, I ended up becoming president of that club probably 10 years later. I end up being part of like 3 or 4 different Toastmasters clubs, because once you sign up for the program and you decide to go all the way through to get your certificate, it takes a while. And through that process, you're doing different things. You're giving tons of speeches. You're in contests. You're actually also helping to run the organization by taking on several different offices. So it's an all-consuming thing. So, once I got involved, and I was just involved.
That's great. And once you really dive in, it really makes it easier to stay involved too. What I think is also really important there is one of the things you talked about is you already knew, you were already speaking, but you didn't really know how to speak. And it taught you the structure and the foundations behind what you were already doing.
That's absolutely true. And I can't tell you how much Toastmasters has helped me, because I used to wonder, before Toastmasters, I'd speak, I had my podcast, I used to, I'd be MC in places. I had jobs that put me on the PA system, and, people was loving my voice, and I was just doing what I was doing. I was just talking. That's just what I was doing in my job. But when I got into Toastmasters, I started to realize that some of the things that they were teaching, I was already doing. I didn't know that I was doing it, though, number one. And number two, of course, I learned on the formalities and structure of creating an actual speech. Of course, taught me things that I already knew but didn't know I knew. And of course, taught me new things, more formal structural things that I didn't know.
One of the things I learned in doing this podcast was I was always very comfortable up on stage and effective in talking with groups, but it wasn't until I started having to every week go through and break down what's happening in public speaking, what's happening in a talk, that I began to sort of understand some of the fundamentals of what I was doing. Why do I do it? Why does it work? Why does this not work? Until you start having to go ahead and take that meta level, take that deeper look into figuring out what you're doing, that's really where there's a lot of learning that can happen that you don't necessarily expect at first.
It was really cool to learn what I was doing in a conscious sense, instead of just it just kind of being natural, which is good. But I liked learning what I was already doing in a formal way. Oh, this is what I was doing, and this is why it was effective. And so it helped me improve it, sharpen it. Even if you have a natural capacity or talent for something, it's still rough. You have to go and polish it off and brush off the edges and learn all the, as you said, metadata to all of it.
So one of the things you talk about a lot is also using spirit energy to attract what you want. Right? What does that mean?
Yeah, spirit energy. I go back and forth with this term because I sometimes when you say spirituality, or that you work with spirituality, or that you're a spiritual person, people automatically think religion. And so I try to dodge that because my message is not religious. But I still want to get a message across about how you work with your own energy, your own spirit energy, the way you come across, the vibes you put out, and how you work with those things to attract what you want, both in your personal and professional lives. So all that really is becoming more conscious of who you are and how you move through the world, becoming more conscious of how other people receive you, and using that along with certain practices like meditation and things like that to kind of keep yourself centered and to keep your spirits up and to keep your mind in a productive thought pattern. And, it may sound like a lot of things now because it's a lifestyle. And I find that really paying attention to the energy you put out to the world, paying attention to the upkeep of your own energy, the upkeep of your own mindset and spiritual health helps you in speaking. Because really, in speaking, you're really presenting yourself. It's not acting. When you're giving a talk, it is a chance for you to be your authentic self and channel your authentic self and your message through that talk. It's important to be conscious about what you're doing. It's important to be excited and confident and enthusiastic about your message and deliver that in your vibe and how you come across.
It almost sounds like the energy you're talking about here is sort of a metaphorical concept for just the impact you have on people around you by your attitude, by your actions, by your clarity of focus. Is that an accurate interpretation?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, aside from authenticity, how can someone leverage that in their presentations?
Everything is all circled around authenticity when you're talking about presentations, because to me, everything that you do on stage is an expression of your authenticity. The way you say things, whether you insert certain, humor into your speeches, maybe some of the ways that you move across the stage, the way you hold your stage presence, all of those things has to do with energy and the energy you're putting out from the audience, how you take the energy in from the audience. But to me, all of it has to do with authenticity, because when you're on stage and you're not acting, then you're essentially being your best self channeled through this speech.
And that matters whether you're doing a keynote at a big training introduction or whether you're doing your monthly staff meeting presenting the latest results of your department's performance to the folks you're working with.
I've had to stand up and give presentations about statistics and things. I've been presidents of organizations and have to give out formal reports, but it's about how you do it. It's about the energy that you come to your presentation with. And even if you have to give boring financial numbers, you can do it in a way where it captivates people's interest. You can add, even your small little flourishes to it, even if it's something formulaic, and to make it at least a little bit unique and to bring new energy to something a little boring.
So we've been talking a lot here about that authenticity, and that is so important to how you live your life and how you conduct your talks and how you conduct yourself day to day to put the right energy out into the world, to get the right energy back so you can achieve those goals. You also teach a lot specifically about the Authentic Man program. What is that about?
Well, it should be said first that I am a certified coach. We talked about Toastmasters, so I've gone through the Toastmasters thing. I'm a distinguished Toastmaster, as well as being a certified coach. And I work with mostly men on being the most authentic version of themselves possible. And so the Authentic Man program is my standard, what they call signature program to accomplish that. There are two versions of it. It's the Authentic Man program, for your personal life. And then is what I call the speaker's version, amp your speaking, because, Authentic Man Project AMP, Authentic Man Pro AMP. So you have to amp your speaking. Basically what that is teaching you all the techniques. The speaking program, of course, is what's most relevant right now, is really getting in there and taking you from what I call a silent whisperer to a confident communicator. So when you are going through the Amp Your Speaking program, especially if you're a very new speaker, because as you may already know, like we have 75% of people who have a fear of public speaking. And so some of my clients, they come and they don't know if they even have a message. Some of them need to help how to communicate better one-on-one. Some of them need more confidence around their message. Some of them need to figure out what their message is. In that program, I take you from whisperer to wow, to being afraid to go on stage, to not being sure if you have anything to say, to not really being sure whether you're even interesting enough. I get you from there all the way to giving your speech on stage, learning how to craft a speech, learning how to project your voice, learning how to believe in your message. Depending on what your end goal is, we even start working on your brand as a speaker. And if you want to get into podcast or YouTubing, we start the foundational work on that. I even work with established speakers who need some sharpening up, because even if you've been in the speaking realm for a while, you can certainly always improve your craft, always improve your delivery, always improve the way you deliver those bullet points. So the Authentic Man program speaker's version just takes you through all of that, all the basics of speaking, all the basics of stage presence and getting across your message. The standard version more has to do with your personal life. It has to do with relationships, sex, and self-image. So I work with men mostly in, single, dating, whatever, who want to attract the right relationships for them, and be more confident in who they are as a person, to kind of eliminate anxiety and stress, negativity, low self-esteem, and kind of turn that around and become more authentic. And by doing that, they will attract better friendships and relationships. They will feel more confident, have a better self-image of themselves, feel more confident in intimate situations and so forth. So that's kind of like the personal life version of it.
So it's a lot of it seems focused then on getting back to the core of who you are, being authentic to who you are, and letting other people see who you are rather than necessarily projecting a false image of a hyper masculine, stereotypical type of approach.
Absolutely. Being authentic. See, that is the key to get everything you want in life, is to be your I always say, don't be yourself, be your best self. Because none of us are perfect. We all have faults. We all have things that could be improved upon. But when you are conscious, when you are more self-aware about the give and take of life and the give and take of energy between people, when you're more self-aware of that, you're better able to consciously dig deep into yourself and unlock what you truly, truly believe and what you truly, truly want underneath all the demands of the world. Because when we grow up, we're told by society, by our parents, by our peers, all the things that we should want to do, all the people we should want to date, all the jobs we should want to have, all the things we should want to own. And sometimes that clouds our judgment, clouds our view of who we are and where we really want to go. And so the whole idea of, Core Confidence Life, which is my business, and some of the programs we're talking about within that, is to step aside from all the stigma, all the negative messages, all the outside messages, and really get to know yourself and take action on the things you find out about yourself to build the life that you want.
We're in a very interesting cultural time over the last few years that I think keys into that. I recall we went through this as a culture sort of starting back in the early 90s. We had an upsurge in questions about what does it mean to be a man? What does masculinity mean? When we started seeing, books like Iron John come out, and we're starting to have a deeper and much more serious discussion about the nature of masculinity now, as how that's tied into things like the concepts of boys will be boys, related to the Me Too movement. And even now, Gillette just kicked off 2019, with an approach that, with an ad campaign sort of attacking the idea of toxic masculinity, and has turned out to be surprisingly controversial about what it means to be a man. With your work in the Authentic Man program and in your speaking program built off of that, I think you probably have a lot of thoughts on that. I was wondering if you could share your perspective on that social conversation we're having in society right now.
Yeah. As you called it, yes. Me being, in the coaching and education field and I hear all the controversy around this idea of toxic masculinity. And I understand that there are some people who get offended or triggered by the term toxic masculinity, thinking that it's attacking all men. But I don't think that it is attacking all men. I don't think that's what it's intended to do. I know some people take it that way. Some people think that the term is kind of like a term that springs from our latest round of culture wars and social justice warriors and all that kind of stuff. But I don't think that the term toxic masculinity is intended to attack all men. I don't think it's anti-male. I don't think it's anti-masculine, because I'm a guy. If I thought it was anti-masculine, I wouldn't even be, I'd be railing against it like everybody else seems, So, and I'll tell you where I think all this is with this toxic masculinity. First, I want to come at things from the word toxic. I think that anything can be toxic when you take it to its absolute extreme. Did you know, just as a side note, did you know that drinking too much water can actually be toxic. You can actually drink too much water.
Dihydrogen monoxide can be a deadly poison.
Yeah, like it takes a long time to do that, but you can actually drink too much water. So I said that point just to say that, there's nothing wrong with masculinity. There's nothing wrong with being a man. We need more people to step up and be men and take responsibility in this society. I think we've probably gotten a little bit away from that. But when you take the concepts or the traditional attributes of what manhood is and you push it all the way to the extreme, it does become toxic. So I can give you an example. The typical example of, men are more logical, women are more emotional. So that's fine. A typical man may lean more in his logic. A typical woman may lean more in her emotions. And that's fine as an archetype just to work with. But when you take the logical man archetype and push it all the way over to having no emotions, no consideration, no compassion, total logic, total coldness, then that's toxic. Because you're taking the idea of logic and you're bringing it out of balance. And so I think that's the message that's being sent by the idea of toxic masculinity. Not that masculinity is bad. It's that we as a society, due to stigmas and hypermasculine pressure, has taken these traditional traits, which are good, and pushed them so far to the extreme where they've become toxic. I think this is an attempt to kind of rebalance that. I think maybe a more effective way is to now that I've seen all these things that's going on, maybe a different term might be better so people don't get as triggered. Because I think that when people get triggered off of the term toxic masculinity, people stop listening to the lessons underneath that term. Maybe I can ask the social justice warriors or something to kind of change, whoever determines these kind of terms to change it. But absolutely nothing wrong with masculinity. Absolutely nothing wrong with manhood. I like it. I happen to be one of them. I don't just play one on TV. But I think that we need to be more conscious on how we've allowed society to get men to take those good, useful, needed qualities and push them to such an extreme where they become toxic.
So how do you think, this discussion around masculinity and what it means to be a man and pushing these archetypes to extremes, how do you think that discussion should affect speakers of different genders? Or how should folks be presenting in light of this broader conversation?
And that's actually a good question. I don't know if I have a clear answer on that. I think that people should try to really be clear about what they mean. Break things down in a way that people can definitely understand it. Because I think sometimes a lot of us who are in this field of coaching and consulting and men's growth and sexuality and cultural studies, I think a lot of us get wrapped up into this jargon of toxic masculinity and divine femininity. We get locked up into all of these terms, not really understanding that some people don't live and breathe this stuff. So we have to be able to break it down where the average person can understand the lessons that are intended when we talk about healthy masculinity and defusing the toxicity of things and moving away from stigma. I think we can just be more intentional about being by simplifying things so people can understand them more. I think toxic masculinity is probably sounds like one of those little inside jargon things that a bunch of us was sitting around talking about. Yeah, toxic masculinity. And then we just kind of marketed it, not really fully grasping that there are people who may have never even thought of these things on this level. And it needs to be broken down where people can understand it better.
Absolutely. And that is sort of a core lesson for speakers on any topic, is that you've got to break down the language that you're going to be using. You've got to rethink the jargon, especially if you're talking to an audience that doesn't live and breathe it in the same way that you do. Whether you're talking about things like gender roles and archetypes, or whether you're talking about sales cycles and product launches. You've got to be able to break it down to make sure that we can all communicate around the same ideas, which ultimately is the core of what we want to do anyway.
Yeah, like you don't want to get on stage and go, yeah, you want to make sure you get ROI and make sure you have your long tail keywords and
I've been to that presentation.
You know what I'm saying? Like you're talking to a general audience about long tail keywords, they're gonna go, what? Yeah. You're talking about talking about SEO. They're gonna go, what? In fact, that reminds me of me. Even people in the jargon can get mixed up. Like I was in a session with my business coach one day, and we were talking about my website and driving traffic to my website, and he says, "Well, I'm sure you're using red tail keywords," and I'm like, "What? Red tail keywords?" And I started talking. I'm like, "Yeah," I said, "Well, I started talking about I use long tail keywords," and he goes, "Well, that's what I meant." I'm like, okay. Like right. He says, I've always heard them called red tail keywords. I've always called them long tail keywords. So it's even within the language and the jargon with people who supposedly are both on the inside of this, even the terms can get still a little bit confusing. Like, how do I know he heard red tail keywords? Where'd you get red tail from?
And for those who are not familiar with these terms, we're referring to the search terms that we can put into Google that may be a little bit more obscure, but will help us pull up our content that may be a year and a half old and still bring it to people's search engine. The long tail refers to how far out a product may be from its original launch. Because when, for example, an initial podcast episode drops or launches or goes live, we get our biggest upswing in the number of people listening to that episode. But if somebody searches for a term for something I talked about a year and a half ago, they may still be one of only one or two people who download that episode that's 18 months old, but that is referring to the long tail.
Yeah, absolutely. So even people who come up with this kind of jargon, I often wondered to myself, like when I was growing up, and I got into all these different things. And I have a little bit of a political history. So, I've seen legislation and things like that. I've always wondered, why do different genres have all this jargon that's unique to that genre? Why don't we just talk regular? Why, like when you write legislation, why do you have to put, whereas the people in the state of New York hereby declare, and whereas we're going to, what is all that? Why don't we just say what we mean instead of creating all this fancy talk to say something simple? But we have it. And so when you're talking about speaking to general audiences about things like toxic masculinity or long tail keywords or New York state law, you got to break things down where the common folk can understand it and get the lessons intended by it.
And you have to be very confident in your message in order to be able to do that. And one of the things you also do is speak to a lot of groups through your Core Confidence podcast. So what is that show about?
Well, Core Confidence, as I mentioned earlier, Core Confidence Life is the name of the business, my business, and that's where the Authentic Man program comes from. And so the Core Confidence podcast is a podcast for the business, and that is my main platform for discussing most things male. So it's formatted as both a monologue and an interview program. It's mixed. So I bring different people on there, men who have overcome challenges around self-esteem, self-confidence, who've overcome challenges around relationships, sex, and self-image. They come and tell their personal stories. I also have people come on the show who have worked with men, even if they're women who've worked with men. They come on there and we talk about action steps for people to be able to take to get past some of these challenges around confidence and everything I just mentioned. And, along with that, I talk about, my programs and, the things and other things that help us move along the path of becoming authentic. So that's primarily what it is a platform for me to commentate and interview people and get their stories out and get their message out.
And it gives you yet one more stage that you can use when you like.
Absolutely. And, there's a lot of interest in podcasting now. There's a lot of podcasts out there, like 250,000 1,000 or whatever the number's supposed to be. And a lot of people that have an interest in doing it. And so if people who have an idea that they want to be a podcaster, but they have no idea, they don't know anything about speaking or because everything is public speaking, even if podcasting. So, that's one of the things that we offer in Amp Your Speaking is, getting prepared to take on that podcast and make sure your brand is going to be something that grows.
So, Dennis, thank you so much for joining us this week. If folks want to know more about you and what you're up to, where should they go?
They should go to coreconfidencelife.com. If you want to know more about me, everything is on there. If you want to hear the podcast, if you want to read more about the Amp Your Speaker program there to get you speaking on stage and behind the mic, or anything else, articles and whatever else I do is on there, coreconfidencelife.com. And you can find the podcast everywhere you find podcasts, iTunes and TuneIn, and you can even ask Alexa to play it for you on TuneIn and all that stuff. So there you go.
Fantastic. And we'll also have those links available over at 2minutetalktips.com/coreconfidence. So Dennis, this has been great. Thanks so much for joining us this week.
It was a pleasure to be here. I always like talking about being your authentic self and speaking your truth. I always enjoy that.
You can learn more about Dennis by heading on over to his website, which you can find over at 2minutetalktips.com/coreconfidence. Along with his website, you'll also find links to Dennis's social profiles, as well as the Gillette ad campaign that I referenced earlier in the episode. You can find that again, 2minutetalktips.com/coreconfidence. Be sure to share this episode with friend, colleague, or relative by giving them the link, 2minutetalktips.com/coreconfidence. Be sure to subscribe for free to 2 Minute Talk Tips in your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. And, of course, as always, don't get best, get better. Thanks a lot. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you next week.
Two-Minute Talk Tips is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.